I'm standing on the Marco Polo terraces in the harbor city of Hamburg. Our journey through time takes place from 1891 to 1897 and begins here in this modern part of the city. You can see the Elbphilharmonic behind me, our contemporary centerpiece and flagship symbol for the music-filled city of Hamburg. This is where Gustav Mahler first set foot on the ground in Hamburg, late in the afternoon of March 26, 1891 at 5:30 p.m. It was at the Berlin train station, which was located somewhere around here. The station was an expansion of the Bergedorf train station, which had been expanded by one building and constructed with red bricks and polished cornices, with a 25.5-meter high and 148-meter long wooden hall with 4 tracks. So the platform onto which Gustav Mahler alighted when he stepped off the train was a true jewel. At that time, this station was located south of today's main train station. It stretched from the north of our current Deichtorhals to the Canal Lock. Gustav Mahler arrived as the ex-director of the Budapest Royal Opera. He was discovered by Bernhard Pollini, the Hamburg theater entrepreneur and then general manager of the City Theater. Besides Pollini, Mahler only knew Hans von Bülow, the famous conductor, who had been living in Hamburg since 1887. Pollini brought Mahler, who was known for being difficult, to his home stage, which had a reputation comparable to the best opera houses of Berlin at that time. He already knew what he had in Mahler, an excellent musician with enormous repertory knowledge, an inexorable orchestra director, and a perceptive accompanist for singers whose aura could enrapture audiences. So, of course, he was a financial magnet.
Arriving via Vienna and Berlin, Gustav Mahler stepped onto the now abandoned and non-existent Berlin train station, his first time on Hamburg soil, on Maundy Thursday, March the 26th, 1891, at 5:30 in the afternoon. His first nights were spent in Streit's Hotel at Jungfernstieg 34, one of the top locations in the Hanseatic city. In contrast to today, there were numerous luxury hotels around the Hamburg Inner Alster Lake, in which Mahler was often a guest, mostly to take his meals there, particularly because he was single during his first years in Hamburg. The food in Streit's Hotel was reputed to be very good. One of Mahler's favorite dishes on the menu at that time was Silesian Heaven, a dish served with potato dumplings, smoked pork belly and baked fruit. In the summer of 1891, Mahler was searching for an apartment and found one here in Heimhuder Street 54. His boss here in Hamburg, Bernhard Pollini, let him stay in this apartment when he was away. And because the servants were also included in the deal, Mahler could take his meals here as well. He described the apartment as cozy. I had dinner at Frau Markus a few days ago. It was so dreadfully boring, and I became so nervous and fidgety that I had to jump up in the middle of it and go out, and I rushed around the city for an hour before coming back, Mahler writes to his sister. In his first year in Hamburg, 1891, he was invited to dinner with Adele Markus and her young daughter Toni, here, at number 60 or 62, almost next door to the Villa Pollini, through a chance meeting. And they met often after that. And an exchange of letters with this very cultured lady, Adele Markus, can be traced up to 1908. And in 1910, the two ladies even went to Munich for the first performance of Mahler's Eighth Symphony.
Besuchten die beiden Damen sogar die Uraufführung der 8. Symphonie von Mahler in München.
We are now in the street Große Bleichen, which, by the way, looked completely different in the 19th century. In November 1891, Mahler wrote to his sister Justine with a new home address. Große Bleichen, Hotel Royal. In another message, Mahler wrote, "I'm well taken care of in my new home. Of course, it's expensive, but what can we do?" 3 months later, in February 1892, the situation sounded completely different. "I'm moving out of here the day after tomorrow. I can't take the ruckus anymore, and despite weeks of incessant searching, I unfortunately can't find another apartment. I'm moving back into my old apartment in Streit's Hotel because of it. I know it's much more expensive, but what should I do? I can't sleep one night more with all of the doors being slammed shut, neighbors' boots being taken off, and drunks falling up and down in the hall." The building in which the Hotel Royal was housed no longer exists. In the house Alsterglatze 10, which was destroyed in World War II, Hans von Bülow lived on the second floor in a spacious and elegant apartment with a view of the Alster. He was indisputably the most important musician in Hamburg when Mahler arrived. As a piano virtuoso and one of the most prominent conductors of the 19th century, he was seen as being on the same level as his contemporaries Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. He also met Felix Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann when he was a young man. Von Bülow had been a glowing admirer of Richard Wagner since 1842, till Wagner began an affair with Bülow's wife and Liszt's daughter Cosima in 1863, whom he left in 1867. This love triangle was a prominent scandal in the salons of the bourgeoisie. After many stops in Munich and other cities, he became conductor of the Mining Court Orchestra, which Bülow had formed into an elite orchestra and, together with Johannes Brahms, led to international fame. From 1887 to 1893, he was the head conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. From November 1886 on, he also oversaw the new subscription concerts of the Berlin concert agent Hermann Wolf in Hamburg. From that time on, Hans von Bülow became a resident of Hamburg. The long-wished-for first meeting of Bülow and Mahler finally took place sometime around November or December 1891. Mahler was very eager for Bülow's recognition and protection. After their encounter, Mahler wrote a letter to his friend Friedrich Löhr. "When I played my funeral rite for him," meaning the first movement of the Second Symphony, "he fell into a nervous horror and explained that Tristan, in comparison to my piece, is a pagan symphony, and he behaved like a crazy person." Mahler also told his composer friend Josef Bohuslav Förster about this encounter. After playing his memoir piece, The Pilgrim, Bülow's judgment was, "If that's supposed to be music, then I don't understand anything about music." Despite that, Bülow felt a great respect for Gustav Mahler as a conductor. After a benefit concert on April the 15th, 1893, Mahler received a large laurel wreath with a ribbon on which was printed "The Pygmalion of the Hamburg Opera." On the 12th of February, Bülow died suddenly while on convalescent leave in Cairo. After the return of his body by ship, there was, one must say, almost a state funeral in the St. Michaelis Church on March the 29th, 1894, where Gustav Mahler was present and received the decisive inspiration for the last movement of his Second Symphony, which was almost finished at the time. This was when he heard the Klopstock hymn, The Resurrection. "Rise again, yes, rise you will, my dust." Bülow's impressive memorial is still well taken care of today and lies in Ohlsdorf Cemetery in the northern part of Hamburg. After his death, Mahler led the new subscription concerts, which were organized by Hermann Wolf for the Philharmonic Society. Mahler had already filled in for Bülow there in 1892. In the end, his early death lent wings to the rise of the conductor Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler is an extremely important name, which has, of course, a strong connection to the city of Hamburg. From the perspective of the 21st century, we see how much influence Mahler had, particularly as a composer. During my life, for example, the whole idea and the reaction and love from audiences for his music have developed tremendously. I can still remember that even my parents were not 100% convinced by Mahler's music when I was very young. And then later, particularly during the second half of the 20th century, it became more and more clear how important his way of thinking is and what role he played in the entire history of music. And nowadays, we are so completely convinced that his works act as a kind of bridge between the 19th and 20th centuries, that we sometimes forget that during his lifetime he was first and foremost a very influential and extremely dominant figure as a conductor. He was a champion of new music, for example. He was an absolutely modern conductor in the sense that he had established a very high standard for his orchestra. The orchestra was truly under the influence of an obsessive perfectionist. Many things which were written about him during that time described a musician who wanted absolute precision and perfection, not only from the musicians, but also on the stage. He did a lot for the modern composers of that time. For example, he organized the German premiere of Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin here in Hamburg, with the composer himself sitting in the audience. Tchaikovsky and Onegin are, of course, part of the standard repertoire today, but at that time it was completely modern music. He did a lot for Smetana, but of course he also demanded that many of the fundamental composers of the German repertoire should be heard, like Mozart, Beethoven, and also Wagner, particularly Wagner. He was a champion of Wagner performances. His own compositions were perhaps not so definitively received in Hamburg at the time, but despite that, we see in hindsight that a part of his Second Symphony was written here. And Mahler himself conducted his own symphonies. The Fifth was conducted here particularly often. But during this intense period, from 1891 to 1897, in these 6 years, Mahler was extremely present. We can see it from our archives. He gave more than 650 performances, which is quite a lot by today's standards. And he tried to turn the state opera into a world-class leadership position international house. He was particularly difficult, very intensive, and had, as I mentioned, this almost obsessive nature to try to bring a performance to absolute perfection. He was a perfectionist. This was combined with a strong faith that the future comes from the support of the next generation of composers. It's well known what Mahler did for Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern, for example. But it can also be seen for other composers, e.g. Americans. He was fiercely criticized and considered controversial during his time in Vienna with young composers, and wanted to constantly set newer and higher standards. And then, when he went to New York to conduct the New York Philharmonic, it was the same thing. He wasn't particularly popular with the audience. Of course, they were very proud to have a figure like Mahler there. But when Mahler brought so much new music with him and worked so hard with the musicians, it also caused controversy. But this is why, as I said at the beginning, that it's important to think of the following. Mahler as an influence is a result of what he did. Naturally, he was a masterful composer, but he was also a humanist, a futurist, and deeply invested in the future. We can see through various articles, also from things he wrote himself, that he naturally believed in the future. But for him, the key to a good future lay in a profound understanding and mastery of the past. And mastery of the past. We can see how deeply rooted he was in the past. And through that, he wanted to move into the future. And that future would be earned through the support of the next generation. And that is why we can say today, in the 21st century, that we think of Mahler as a modern figure. During his years in Hamburg, Mahler managed an unbelievably huge workload. His repertoire included no fewer than 70 operas and numerous new productions from Mozart to Wagner. For some many years, he stood on the podium almost every other evening. It's no wonder that rest and relaxation were rare for him. On December the 25th, 1892, he wrote to his sister, "I spent Christmas Eve last night alone in a tavern, or rather in a Viennese cafe, and drank 2 glasses of Pilsner and ate a beefsteak as usual. I went to bed early at 10:30 and was finally able to sleep for a long time." The Viennese cafe on New Jungfernstieg was also the place for a meeting between Mahler and the George Frederick Handel researcher Friedrich Chrysander, which took place through the facilitation of Ferdinand Pohl. Chrysander wanted to try to awaken Mahler's interest in Handel's oratorios and get him to perform one of them in one of his Friday concerts. This attempt failed, for understandable reasons, if we follow what Pohl wrote about their encounter in his memoirs. 2 unique figures came together at the Viennese cafe on New Jungfernstieg. The idiosyncratic, unpredictable Mahler and, despite all attempts to be kind in describing his personality, the crabby and rather insensitive Chrysander. I myself was not able to participate in the meeting. It was enough for me to bring both gentlemen together there in the cafe. On the same evening, Mahler played into my hands. I asked him, "Well, what did you think of Chrysander? How was your meeting?" He hid behind an opaque mask and satisfied himself by saying, "Chrysander, well, you know, he's certainly very clever." On the street Neuer Wall, directly across from the Goetz Palace, which was known as the former official residence of the chief of police, a monument reminds us of a famous mayor of Hamburg, whom Mahler must have met before he died a few months later in November 1892. Because in a letter to his sister Justine, dated February 1892, he wrote, "I've been invited to go to Mayor Peterson's on Wednesday. A great honor, seeing that he is the top personality in the Republic of Hamburg." The domicile of the family was no longer on Neuer Wall as of 1875, but both the Goetz Palace and the residence in the Große Theaterstraße counted under Peterson's aegis as some of the favorite places for artists to meet. Karl Peterson received credit for the development of Hamburg in turbulent times. He advocated forward-looking decisions, for example, implementing plans for the creation of a sewer system or the construction of the General Hospital in Eppendorf. Peterson also did great service for the Hamburg theatrical scene. The City House, today called the City Courtyards, was the seat of the Hamburg police until 1943. Within this complex of buildings, central commands were located. Hundreds of employees were working here, both for the Gestapo and the Criminal Investigation Department. During the Nazi regime, the persecution of political opponents was organized here. Groups such as Jews, Romanis and Sinti, homosexuals, as well as others. With that, the City House was a center of terrorism and violence. Even during his life, Mahler felt the force of how hard it was to be recognized socially and professionally in the face of his Jewish background, not to mention reaching his career goals. He had already experienced this during his time in Budapest. In Vienna, too, an anti-Semitic campaign contributed to him having to give up his post as director of the Viennese Court Opera. As far as his works are concerned, they had a hard time getting recognition before the Mahler Renaissance in 1960, even if there was a short flourishing in the 1920s. But then he was forgotten, ignored, or even forbidden. Due to his Jewish heritage, the 9 symphonies of Mahler will be struck from the programming of German concerts, was the motto of Nazi Germany. For example, in Mayer's concert guide from 1937. Thanks to the Canadian music critic Richard Newman, we know a lot of details today about the fate of Alma Rosé. Her parents were Arnold Rosé, concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and director of the famous Rosé Quartet, and Justine Mahler, Gustav Mahler's sister. The highly talented young girl was a virtuoso violinist who toured throughout Europe with her group, the Viennese Waltz Girls. After Austria joined the Nazis, she continued to give performances in the Netherlands, but then had to flee to France, where she was arrested by the Gestapo and deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. Until her death in 1944, she led the concentration camp chamber orchestra, the so-called Girls' Orchestra. A grim summary of the events was formulated by Anita Lasker-Wallfisch. Gustav Mahler stood at her crib, while Joseph Mengele stood at her bier. Gustav Mahler's brother-in-law, Edward Rosé, also didn't survive the Nazi regime. He performed as a solo cellist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra and was later the first cellist of the State Orchestra of Weimar. Although he had already converted to Protestantism in 1891, he was persecuted as a Jew during the Nazi regime. In 1941, the 82-year-old protested without success against having to wear the Star of David and was taken into custody by the Gestapo. In September 1942, he was deported to Theresienstadt, where he died on January 24, 1943. He was talking about the palace on Esplanade 37 when Mahler wrote to his sister Justine in December 1892 that he'd been invited to a very fine dinner, and then a couple of days later that he spent Christmas Eve with the widowed Dr. Lazarus, an elderly lady with equally elderly sisters, unmarried, whose brother from Vienna was known as Dr. Schiff. In this circle, Mahler understandably played a starring role, notwithstanding his crankiness, reticence, and his defensive behavior. Nothing more than his presence was expected, and this was enough for all of the participants of the company. And if someone else had reported about one of these evenings, it would surely have begun with the sentence, "Mahler was there." The mistress of the house was the highly intelligent Dr. Henriette Lazarus, a sister-in-law of Julius Rodenberg. Her unmarried sisters were the two Schiff ladies. In Hamburg high society, the three sisters were known as the Three Master. Ferdinand Pfohl also held the salon in high esteem. I usually met Mahler at the stage door after opera performances which I attended, and then we strolled over to Esplanade, showed up at the lady's house, and refreshed ourselves with a cup of tea, delightful caviar and salmon rolls, and similar delicacies. But we were even more delighted with the brilliant and witty conversation of the three ladies, who knew how to enrapture us with their Austrian temperament and sophistication. It happened more than once that Mahler sat down at the grand piano in the music salon and played the Hammerklavier Sonata by Beethoven, or one of his last sonatas, which he brought to life with his own typical business-like rendition. In these rooms, I got to know the acrimonious Theodor Kirchner, the amicable Anton Rubinstein, the scintillatingly witty Moritz Rosenthal, then later Baron von Berger, a famous specialist in Germany, Erich Schmidt from Berlin, people with famous names and other eminent figures, among them the likable actor Karl Wagner or the highly celebrated Franziska Elmenreich. Also with the songs of a wayfarer, some who were convinced and others hesitant about him, all became friends with Gustav Mahler and got to know him here in these rooms, which maintained a highly cultured society. But there were not only positive associations which connected Mahler to this salon business. I quote, "These local professional wailing women, Mrs. Lazarus Petersen and Mrs. Schiff, were a complete disaster. Either you had to bang your head against a wall or laugh yourself sick. I did both." This is a play upon the grief after the death of Bülow. This is a play upon the grief after the death of Bülow. The building on the Esplanade, whose facade withstood the bombings of World War II, indirectly entered into world literature. Thomas Mann describes it in his novel The Magic Mountain as the residence of Senator Hans Lorenz Castorp. We're now on Jungfernstieg, directly on the banks of the Inner Alster. Mahler stayed in Streit's Hotel from time to time, and as we know from his letters, he certainly must have sought out the Alster Pavilion. It looked completely different at that time. In 1891, it was already the third version of a facility which had first opened its gates in 1799. The architect responsible for the expansion and renovation of the building in the 1870s was also the person who played a decisive role in the construction of the Hamburg City Hall, Martin Haller. It was here that Gustav Mahler must have enjoyed his cup of Mokka, whether in company or alone. Arnold Berliner was an example of someone who might have accompanied him, a renowned physicist who became the head director of an AEG establishment in Hamburg in 1891, and whom Mahler had met shortly after that. There's evidence that the Berliner taught Mahler the basics of the English language, in light of his guest contract in London in the summer of 1892. Arnold Berliner was a passionate expert in the field of natural sciences and also publisher of a renowned professional journal in which Albert Einstein, among others, was published. But due to its Jewish background, it was excluded and humiliated during the Nazi time. In March 1942, he was found dead in his apartment at the age of 79, and there's no doubt that it was suicide, probably due to his impending deportation. Shortly after Gustav Mahler moved into Bundesstraße 10 in the spring of 1892, he wrote to his sister Justine that he lived very close to the zoo. He spoke of hearing the lions roar and how he wasn't pleased at all about the noises in his surroundings. Screaming children, braying animals, a piano-playing neighbor. So, to put it succinctly, he didn't feel at all at home in this apartment. However, he got to know cycling during this time. We have to imagine Mahler as a young man at this time, 30 or 31 years old, full of energy. And it's still legendary that this creative person lived in Hamburg, to be exact, here in Bundesstraße 10 for more than a year. It was a dramatic time, which Mahler experienced in this street since cholera broke out in 1892, and Mahler was in Berchtesgaden for a summer vacation when he heard about the epidemic. He then refused to return to Hamburg directly before beginning his contract with the theatre, because the street his apartment was on at the time was badly hit by this pandemic. There were numerous deaths in Bundesstraße, and he first arrived 4 weeks after the season had begun, for which he was threatened with the withdrawal of his entire year's pay if he didn't show up to work on time. One has to imagine the time he spent here as heavily work-intensive in the bustling, extremely productive business of the theatre. A young, burning conductor, always pursuing the highest standards of quality. What cannot so easily be seen or perceived is the inner world which a composer always carries with them, regardless of where they are, whether on a bike, at an evening party, or in rehearsal. No one can really know what's going on inside their minds. It's only shown in their results. In this case, it was the second and third symphonies and a number of songs which were composed here in Hamburg. We know this music very well, and when we're in such a place where he actually lived, it's surely wonderful and interesting to imagine that in addition to all of the outside goings-on and all of his outside activities, it was his inner space from which his music came into being. I don't know anyone else who knows the stations of Mahler's life here in Hamburg better than you, Albrecht. And it would be interesting to hear your view about what was so particular about the time during which he lived in Bundesstraße 10. Yes, the most extraordinary thing, I would say, is that a neighbor, actually an older neighbor, taught Mahler how to ride a bike during this time. This neighbor was Wilhelm Zinne, who was a critic and a very well-informed connoisseur of music. They bonded through their mutual love of the music of Anton Bruckner, and Zinne gave Mahler advice about buying and riding a bicycle. He was a humorous conversation partner. There are only a few cards Mahler ever wrote to people which were as humorous as the ones he sent to the slightly crazy Wilhelm Zinne, who lived in Bundesstraße 9, right next door. So, he learned to ride a bike here. What else was important at that time? Yes, he was single at that time and had to keep his romantic relationship with the singer Anna von Mildenberg a secret. Shortly after the relationship began, both his sisters came to Hamburg. It became complicated in light of their presence to have a secret lover in Hamburg, which couldn't have been easy for the dynamic young man. He worked a great deal during that time. You've already mentioned that there were rehearsals, sometimes several performances a day in the opera house, afternoon performances, evening performances, later then also symphony concerts, which he had taken over from Hans Bülow, even though they weren't to start until the following season. Even as I sit here at the desk, which you know so well, a military band is playing in the Zoological Gardens. Always the same roaring lions, exotic cattle bellowing. Too bad there aren't any rattlesnakes there. I'm sure they would rattle. This is how we find out from Gustav Mahler about the Zoological Gardens, reported from his apartment in Bundesstraße 10. We could see that Mahler had his difficulties with the noise. The zoo is located where the botanical garden Planten und Blumen stands today. It first opened on May 17th, 1863. The first director was Alfred Brehm, in his capacity as a well-known animal researcher. By the way, Martin Haller, the then young architect we mentioned before, participated in the construction of the zoo. Hotel Belvedere, where Mahler was often a guest, either by himself or with friends, has a restaurant with a high-class menu. Let me quote from the menu. Steamed eel, butter and potatoes, bœuf à l'anglaise, veal fricassee, spinach with eggs, etc. We also know a little bit about Mahler's culinary preferences from his friend and music critic for Hamburg's news sources, Ferdinand Pfohl, who was also from Bohemia and had been living in Hamburg since 1892. For example, Mahler was simply a poor eater, a situation in which both of them who sought out the restaurant in Hotel Belvedere took place as follows. Right after the soup, he'd already taken a Havana out of his cigar bag, placed it on the snow-white tablecloth, and gathered his courage. If you eat your soup, you may smoke this good cigar afterwards. He used the same reward strategies after every course, and enticed himself with this rather unusual method to eat more heartily. And when we managed to eat the sherbets and dessert, he then smoked his Havana with an expression of happiness and contentment in his otherwise normally gloomy face, in which I hardly ever found the opportunity again to observe this level of human strength in him. We are now here at New Jungfernstieg, house number 20, where Photo Studio A. Bieber was located during Mahler's time. Mahler had portraits done here in the fall of 1893, which the owner of the store considered so good that they were displayed in the store window for a long time. As coincidence would have it, the gaze of an 18-year-old musician who had applied for the job of accompanist at the City Theatre fell on these portraits. We are talking about Bruno Walter, who described this in his memoirs. On Jungfernstieg, a portrait in the display windows of Bieber's studio gripped me, who was obviously at first glance a musician. With a second glance, I knew it must be Mahler. Only the composer of the Titan could look like that. The next morning, I recognized him again. Pale, thin, small in stature, a longish face, his forehead framed by deep black hair, meaningful eyes behind glasses, furrows of pain and humor in his face, which demonstrated astounding changes in expression when he spoke with someone. He kindly asked me about my musical abilities and knowledge, which I could report to his visible satisfaction with a mixture of shyness and confidence, and left me with a feeling of numbness and shock. Mahler appeared to me in his expression and demeanor to be part genius and part demon. A productive working relationship developed between Mahler and the 18-year-old Bruno Walter shortly after this. Among other things, he gave him such demanding tasks as the arrangement of his first symphony for piano duo. Here, at the corner of Reeperbahn and Helgoländer Allee, which leads into Ost-West Street, was once the very grandiose former concert house of the brothers Ludwig. On October the 27th, 1893, here in the red light district on the other side of Millantor, Gustav Mahler performed his first symphony in a large concert hall. He didn't trust himself to have it performed within the city limits of Hamburg. The premiere had already taken place in Budapest in 1889. 6 songs from Des Knaben Wunderhorn were also performed. Under Mahler's baton, eminent soloists sang the part, the famous baritone Paul Bulz and the soprano Clementine von Schuch-Porska, wife of the Dresden conductor Ernst von Schuch. The actor Karl Wagner was also part of the Hamburg Artists' Society to which Mahler belonged, and he also lived in Kolonnaden, which was an extremely fine street during Mahler's lifetime. In a text about the creation of his second and third symphonies in Steinbach, Mahler's nephew Alfred Rosé reflected on what his mother Justine had reported from Mahler's summers at the Attersee. Among other things, while he was working on larger works, his meals needed to be simple and lean, because he often suffered from migraines, which would make him horribly sick. Mahler didn't drink alcohol at that time. Clear spring water was his drink of choice. He smoked a few cigarettes and occasionally cigars. In Hamburg, from where Mahler went to Steinbach during the summer vacations, Karl Wagner gave him a packet of imported cigars at his benefit concert. Mahler took them with him on his summer vacations, and when he was particularly satisfied with his work, he allowed himself the pleasure of smoking one of them. During lunch, he would then get up, take out the cigar rolled in gold paper, and would put it on the table with a smirk. Then everyone knew that he had composed something successfully, and it satisfied him. This one cigar was his daily ration. We are now in Rotenbaum Street 13 to 15, where the Curio House has been located since 1911. The Vogtsche Conservatory once stood here. We are again referring to Mahler's friend Ferdinand Pohl. He was a writer on musical themes during Mahler's time. Today he would be called a young music historian, and also a critic who wrote for various newspapers. Mahler and Pohl both networked within Hamburg society. They would introduce each other in places where one of them was already known. That was, so to say, a mutually successful societal coordination in the Hamburg scene. Pohl later taught at and became co-director of the Vogtsche Conservatory in the subjects music theory, music history, and, as it is so intriguingly called, style and interpretation, up to 1948. But Pohl and Mahler fell out towards the end of Mahler's time in Hamburg. Their parting was probably due to the fact that personal relations were put on the back burner too often, and Mahler did not pay enough attention to him. But Ferdinand Pohl wrote a notable obituary when Mahler died in 1911 about his influence on the city of Hamburg. Pohl himself lived in Sechslingspforte. We are now here in Fröbel Street, where Gustav Mahler lived at number 14. You will immediately notice when you quickly look back and forth that there's no longer a number 14. This house number was destroyed in the war, and yes, today we have the university campus in this area. Mahler lived on the 3rd floor. It was still a small apartment before his sisters Justina and Emma followed him here in 1893. And perhaps we can imagine the house like this one, which still stands here. Mahler lived on the 3rd floor, and one more little memory. Josef Bohuslav Förster met Mahler while he was in the process of committing the finale of his 2nd symphony to paper. We are now in the part of the city called Altona, which was a city in its own right during Mahler's time. Behind me at numbers 28 as well as 30, according to today's reckoning, and number 164 according to earlier reckoning, was where the Altona City Theatre was located. The Altona City Theatre was directed by the same man who directed the Hamburg City Theatre, Bernhard Pollini, and it played with the same ensemble. The building which was here before, recognizable also with the corner houses which are still standing and which flanked the Altona City Theatre, were newly built here after the War of 1876. And in the hall of the theatre, which was considered very grand, famous artists such as Franziska Elmenreich, Paul Wegener and the young Gustav Knuth stood on the stage. In 1943, the house unfortunately fell victim to bombs. During Mahler's time, he conducted, for example, Haydn's Creation here, on a public holiday. That was only possible here in liberal Altena, because musical events were forbidden on public holidays in Hamburg at that time. The theatre's restaurant was run after 1923 by a close friend of Mahlers, the famous tenor Willy Birnkofen, who had built up his career in Bochum before that, and who, as an older singer, lost his entire fortune with speculations on the stock market, and so, towards the end of his life, became the theatre's barkeeper. The ice cellar, where supplies were stored, and which can still be recognized by its entrance today, is here. Klopstock's grave in Ottensen was a well-known destination for pilgrims of Europe's intellectual elite, just as the Goethe and Schiller city Weimar was later. The grave stands directly next to Christian's church, so named after the ruling Danish king Christian VI of Denmark and Norway, and was built from 1735 to 1738 according to plans by Otto Johann Müller. If the memoirs of Josef Bohuslav Förster's The Pilgrim are true, the story is as follows. After a performance of Fidelio in the Altena City Theatre, he went with his composer colleague Förster, who was over the moon at the performance, and with Mildenborg, meaning Anna von Mildenborg, soprano and girlfriend of Mahler, who incomparably sang the part of Leonora, and then went with Gustav Mahler through the silent streets of Altena at night, past Klopstock's grave. On the morning of March the 28th, 1894, Gustav Mahler attended the funeral of the renowned conductor Hans von Bülow here in the St. Michaelis church. During the service, the boys' choir of St. Michaelis sang the then well-known hymn from Klopstock's poem The Resurrection. You, my dust, will rise again after a short rest. The one who made you will give you immortal life. Mahler reported, "It struck me like a bolt of lightning, and everything stood clearly before my soul. The Creator waits for this bolt. It's the Immaculate Conception." During his lifetime, Hans von Bülow highly prized Mahler's conducting, but he was never truly able to find a connection to his accomplishments as a composer. Mahler reported that von Bülow reacted with nervous horror when he played his funeral rite to him. And now, of all times, at Bülow's funeral, Mahler received the decisive inspiration for the finale of his Second Symphony. What fascinates me about Mahler is that as a composer, he is a headstrong, religious thinker who converted from Judaism to Catholicism and was well suited to conveying the biblical message in his own way. He transformed it and gave it a place in cultural life which still has an impact today. Yesterday I took a walk with Berliner in the Flottbeck Valley through the parks, and then we ate together in the Park Hotel. Mahler reported to his sister in a letter from February 16, 1894, that he took a walk with his friend Arnold Berliner over the Flottbeck Valley and the magnificent park which belonged to Senator Jenisch. At the end of their excursion, they stopped for a bite to eat at the Park Hotel Teufelsbrück. Many famous personalities ate here, such as the famous tenor Enrico Caruso, or Otto von Bismarck, or the painter Franz von Lehnbach. He also sent greetings to his sister Justine to Rome in the form of a postcard on March the 21st, 1894, from an excursion from Blankenese to the Sülberg, together with Hermann and Louise Behn. During his time in Hamburg, Mahler also had contact with the Haller family, who were part of the educated elite. The Hallers moved into a representative mansion here on the outer Alster Lake, right near Alster Terrace 2. And this villa developed into a meeting point for Hamburg's music lovers. House concerts regularly took place in the salon of the house, to which the lady of the house, Toni Haller, would invite people. She herself was an excellent singer, and her daughters Margarete and Marie played the violin as well as the piano. We can ascertain from Martin Haller's records that famous musicians such as Josef Joachim or Hans von Bülow, Ferruccio Bossoni, and of course Gustav Mahler were among the guests. Many of them, according to Martin Haller, simply stopped by once, others would attend more often. Mahler seemed to belong to the latter, as we can conclude from a letter to his sister Justine from March 1894. I don't go to dinner parties and am only seldom invited. People are slowly and finally realizing that the pleasure of my company is only a small one. But Haller will let go, and also the famous Behrendt. I'm going to the former this evening, but never again to the latter, of course, without ever giving the real reason. Josef Bohuslav Förster describes Mahler's apartment in Parkallee as cozy. He moved into this apartment after the one in Fröbel Street became too small. Both of his sisters, Emma and Justine, followed Mahler to Hamburg, and after that they took care of the housekeeping. Gustav Mahler, the bicycle, and Hamburg. How does this fit together? During his 6 years in Hamburg, there were great strides in the development of the bicycle, also called the Velocipede, in Germany, but also in many other countries in Europe. At the end of the 1880s, the first bicycles with diamond frames were brought onto the market, and shortly after that, pneumatic tires filled with air, almost as we know bicycles today. And they aroused great enthusiasm in many people, also in Gustav Mahler. And there is evidence of how impatient he was to finally learn the art of riding a bicycle. This is what he wrote to his friend and neighbor Karl Wilhelm Zinne, a teacher at the Adult Continuing Education Center and music critic. And as it happened, also his neighbor in Bundesstraße. Dear Mr. Zinne, when can I begin with learning to ride a velocipede? To be able to ride a velocipede is my innermost desire. wanting to do it, but not being able to, my eternal misfortune. But his practicing must have led rather quickly to success, and he was determined to buy his own bicycle. This original bicycle unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but this historical bicycle is most likely the nearest thing to the original. It's a bicycle of an English collector from Brighton, which, thanks to a generous donation from a member of the Mahler Association, could then be bought for the museum. I am now standing here on the Michaelis Bridge over the Herrengraben Fleet. The bridge leads directly to Admiralitätsstreet, which is most likely where Mahler bought his bicycle. There is evidence that he was also advised by his friend Karl Wilhelm Zinner when he purchased his bicycle. In a letter to Zinner, he wrote that it would cost 340 marks, and where he would buy it. From Heinrich Reck, a dealer for bicycles and sewing machines, whose shop was in Admiralitätsstreet 62 and 63. We think that the model of bicycle was a Pyramidal number 41153, which was offered by the dealer Reck. It's also possible that it was a bicycle from the well-known Dresden company Seidel and Naumann, which was also sold by Reck. In any case, we're talking about a bicycle in a mid-range price class. An inexpensive bicycle cost 240 marks, an expensive one 500. We can glean from another letter to his friend Zinner that the purchase of this bicycle must have been a great success. He wrote the following: "I'm admired everywhere I go on my bike. I really seem to be born to ride a bicycle and will surely be appointed a member of the Privy Council." Here behind me, where you can see this convent garden-like office building, there used to be an illuminated restaurant in a garden in Fuhlentwiete 67, which was also open at night. There was also an outside podium there where concerts took place. A large concert hall was built here later, called Wörner's Convent Garden. It was here that Mahler, as the successor to Hans von Bülow after his death, conducted symphony concerts for the Philharmonic during the season 1894 to 1895 for a short while. It was a series by the Berlin concert promoter Hermann Wolf. Philharmonic concerts took place for many years in the convent garden. Before Gustav Mahler, musicians such as Richard Wagner, Hans von Bülow, and after him Bruno Walter and Wilhelm Furtwängler conducted concerts here. Erna Sack, Fyodor Shaliapin and Richard Tauber were among the singers heard here. Clara Schumann, Jascha Heifetz, Wilhelm Kempf and Claudia Arau were soloists who came and went. During the beginning years of the Nazi regime, numerous and important concerts of the Hamburg Jewish Cultural Alliance took place here as well. Guests included the tenor Joseph Schmidt and the renowned contralto Sabine Kalter, a local Hamburg champion who organized evenings of songs and arias which played to packed audiences. Many people from Hamburg also remember opulent balls and other popular events in this hall. The reconstruction of the convent garden was overseen by the star architect Martin Haller, who was also later a friend of Gustav Mahler, in 1870. The building, which must have had extremely good acoustics, was unfortunately destroyed by bombing in 1943. The Axel Springer building was later built on the piece of land where the convent garden was once located. We are now in Born Street, in the formerly Jewish-influenced Grindel Quarter in Hamburg. The Grindel Quarter was also influenced by numerous artists who lived here, including Gustav Mahler for a time, as well as his composer colleague Josef Bohuslav Förster, a Czech composer who was about the same age as Mahler and was married to a famous opera singer, who was engaged at the Hamburg Opera House starting in 1893. And Mahler gave her leading roles on account of her excellent qualities as a soprano. He asked who had studied the pieces with her, because she was already perfectly prepared when she arrived at the first rehearsal, and also prepared in a way that appealed to Mahler's detailed musical tastes. A friendship developed between the composers, and the soprano was the link in this friendship. Later, Förster Lauterer became a protege of Mahler, also during his time in Vienna. She was often invited to guest performances there. Förster, who lived to be almost 100, had a very exceptional memory towards the end of his life. He wrote a long book, which is the source of many details for us about Mahler's time. During his Hamburg time, Förster wrote many chamber music pieces, but also the opera Eva, which became popular but is completely forgotten today. We now find ourselves at another corner of the Grindel Quarter, diagonally opposite the post office Hamburg 13, which is still standing in its original glory, in Schlüter Street, 58. It was here that the Försters, or rather Förster Lauterers, lived in 1893, when the singers' engagement began in Hamburg, and they stayed until 1903. I am standing, as it were, in the middle of Gustav Mahler's way to work. He came from Harvestehude, or rather later from the direction of Eppendorf. Sometimes he would take his bicycle, sometimes the tram. He also probably sometimes went on foot, hurrying along. At any rate, he had to pass the zoological gardens and go through Dammtor Street. In the background you can see the Casino Esplanade, which was a very elegant hotel around the turn of the century. Mahler stayed here when he conducted in 1908 his only conducting engagement in the Leitzhalle, and his wife Alma came a little later and took an elegant room with him in the Hotel Esplanade.
This is the house of Hermann Behn, my great-uncle, who lived here from 1890 until his death in 1927. He was born, however, in the Grindelhof 42 on November 11th, 1859. His father was the Senate syndicate in the Hamburg citizenry. His mother, Frances Elliot Goslar, came from the family who owned the oldest private bank in Germany, the Berenberg Goslar & Co. Bank. His mother died shortly after his birth, and both of his sisters also died young, so that he inherited a notable sum of money later in life. Through his inheritance, Hermann was in the fortunate position of being able to give up jurisprudence and completely commit to concentrating on music. He must have been an excellent pianist, but also a great composer, and an avid concert-goer, particularly the musical dramas of Richard Wagner. He was in Bayreuth quite often, and he was a patron, especially for Gustav Mahler. Between 1883 and 1886, he took lessons with Anton Bruckner in Vienna, and it could be that Behn and Mahler had already met before that time. It was here that he composed 8 song cycles and a piano sonata, Opus 6 in C minor. Both volumes of art songs were printed by Kistner in Leipzig. What he mostly did, however, was edit existing works. For example, the 7th Symphony of his teacher, Anton Bruckner. And Bruckner was thankful and deeply appreciated it, as well as the 50 symphonic movements of the master dramatist Richard Wagner. All of the works were converted for 2 pianos. He also composed the 2nd Symphony from Gustav Mahler in an edition for 2 pianos in this house. And both of them played it, and so now perhaps we can go in. The relationship between Mahler and Behn began in the fall of 1893 and was one of the longest and closest friendships Mahler had. In a letter to Justine from February 1894, Mahler writes, "I'm at Behn's place a lot right now, and I am starting to get used to him. I like the people here more and more, and I believe that a place is being prepared in this house for our future living, which gives us warmth in the winter and shade in the summer. They are downright touching to me right now." Actually, Mahler's little sister, Emma, lived for a time at Behn's house, and we know this because a letter dated on May 1st, 1897 from Mahler in Vienna was sent to the address Oberstraße 87, Dr. Hermann Behn, Harvestehude. When a fair copy of the Resurrection Symphony was finished at the end of 1894, Mahler gave this to Behn so that he knew it would have a secure place in this house while he was on tour. He was overwhelmingly frightened of thunderstorms, and without Mahler knowing, Behn edited the score in only a short time for 2 pianos and showed Mahler upon his return. And then they went into this room and played it. In the end, Mahler was supposed to have said, and this is an anecdote. It cannot be confirmed in writing, but appears to be very credible. "Go into the cellar and get a very good bottle of wine, and we'll drink to brotherhood." It is certainly notable that afterwards, all letters from Mahler to Behn were on a first-name basis, and the salutation was often "Dearest Hermann" or "Dearest Friend" or similar. They then organized a small piano premiere, and Josef Bohuslav Frosta was in attendance. He then wrote in his book that he was also at this piano premiere in Bain's villa at the Alster. The composer and host took their places at the pianos. Some of the guests also included Bülow's old friends and a warm admirer, Mrs. Lazarus. She assured us at the end that she was not any less of a glowing admirer of Gustav Mahler than before. Hermann Behn then got the piano version bound and paid for the printing at Röder in Leipzig. And with that, he had financed the very first printing of Mahler's works. Together with Berghahn, he also participated deeply in the costs of the first performance on December 13th, 1895, in Berlin. And there is a wonderful letter from Mahler from December 1895. Dearest friend, I've just received a sample printing from Röder. I find there is nothing left to wish for. Don't forget that today is the first day that I have the evening free. That's actually a bit strong. How I look forward to your return, although I wish you every indulgence from the bottom of my heart for your rest and recovery in glorious nature, and most notably in this shining weather. You have truly earned it. Yours truly, Gustav Mahler. Mahler gave Behn an autographed copy of the Songs of a Traveling Companion for all that he had done. Behn helped Mahler in many other ways as well. From his own vacation at Timmendorf Beach, he went back to Hamburg to send him sketches to Attersee in Austria, his composing house, which Mahler had forgotten. He had just arrived in Steinbach at the Attersee and realized that he had forgotten sketches for the first movement of his Third Symphony in Hamburg and was in the deepest distress. Hermann Behn actually left his vacation in Timmendorf and drove back to Hamburg, looked for them on Mahler's desk, and sent them via express mail. That's what Mahler had asked him to send back to the Attersee. Behn also took care of the dramatic soprano from the Hamburg City Theatre, Anna von Mildenburg. As mentioned, Mahler had an affair with her during his time in Hamburg. He was even engaged to be married, and he did not want her to go back to Vienna at the same time as he did under any circumstances. So Behn invited her here to the Oberstrasse and then also became Mahler's successor as Anna von Mildenburg's lover. Apparently, Mahler greeted Behn's taking care of the situation warmly, because he wrote on May 17, 1898, "I thank you for your friendly message. I am happy for Mildenburg that she can spend these difficult days at your place. She is well taken care of." Mahler and Behn would see each other again twice in Hamburg. In March 1905, when Mahler conducted his Fifth Symphony, and he wrote on the very first page of the score, "To my dearest friend Hermann Behn, on the day we can happily see each other again." In November 1908, a mutual dinner took place in this house, and later, Hermann Behn wrote about Mahler as a friend, conductor, and composer. Thanks to him, the years between 1891 and 1908 became, for me, the most musically blessed years of his life. It was, in essence, one of the longest friendships of Gustav Mahler, and he had already expressed this in such a kind manner from Steinbach on June 19, 1895. "In the hand of our friendship, which you offered me so kindly, I shake hands to that with joy, and it's a done deal. I believe and hope that we can be something for each other, and I know that what we can be for each other will be us. At our age, such a relationship takes time to develop, but it lasts."
Gustav Mahler is still present today as a renowned conductor in the Opera House in Damtor Street. On the outside wall of the Hamburg State Opera, for example, the first Mahler monument found a place in the urban landscape of Hamburg. The monument is by Milan Knobloch, the Czech sculptor who was born in 1921. It was put here on November the 1st, 1998. Many opera goers who often know the composer Mahler are quite unaware that he conducted here at the Opera House for 6 years. Mahler's singers at that time were Willy Birnkofen, Max Alvary, Katharina Klawski, Hans Friedrich Bötel, Ernestina Schumann-Heink, and Mahler's secret lover, of course, Anna von Mildenburg, to name but a few. From the balcony of the then so-called Hamburg City Theatre, Mahler played Siegfried's Funeral March from Wagner's opera Götterdämmerung with the orchestra's brass on March the 29th, 1894, as the mourners in the funeral cortege of Hans von Bülow silently strode by on Damtor Street, fringed with watchers. Mahler's last apartment in Hamburg was here in Bismarck Street. His most trusted friend, Nathalie Bauer-Lechner, describes this house and this apartment as follows. Mahler lived splendidly here with his sisters. Hohe Luft is the name of this congenial section of town, which was also simultaneously symbolic for Mahler's creativity. It was as fine a place as one could find to live in Hamburg. It was a little house with a yard and a view of fields and fruit trees. The three of them and their two maids had all this to themselves. Mahler had the entire top floor for himself, a piano, a study, and a bedroom. We now find ourselves here in Magdalena Street 50. A place in which two people played a special role during Mahler's time in Hamburg. On the one hand, Anna von Mildenburg, Mahler's lover. She lived for a while in the artist's apartment on Welker Street, and then after she truly became famous, she moved here to the villa suburb. The other was Karl Wagner, who came to Hamburg as an actor at about the same time as Mahler, and was later extremely successful at the Thalia Theater. The results of this friendship were, on the one hand, that Karl Wagner always supplied Mahler with cigars. But, as can be seen from their letters, Karl Wagner also visited Gustav Mahler in the summer of 1896 at Attersee during Mahler's vacation there. I was very happy to come to Hamburg 17 years ago, to Mahler's city in Germany, because Gustav Mahler had been active here longer than in any other German city. And the Gustav Mahler Foundation organizes numerous activities so that the remembrance of Mahler in the city of Hamburg and beyond stays alive. The question of religion in Mahler's creations is particularly interesting and also very important for me. One sees religion in his texts and hears it in his music. For example, let's take the Rückert song At Midnight. The protagonist wrestles with the troubles of the world and wants to relieve the suffering of the world, wants to change the situation but realizes that he can't. And then in the last lines, God, you have the world in your hands, and I relinquish it all to you. This is the real message of the music to which the Rückert text is set. The question of religion also plays a huge role in Mahler's symphonies, sometimes even in their texts. For example, when in the Second Symphony we hear the words, "I want to go to God, and I will not let myself be held back by any angel," or the invocation to the Holy Spirit in the Eighth Symphony. It's sometimes said that Mahler's music is actually something like religious art. That means that art is foremost and not religion, and religion is perhaps even subsumed into the art and dissipates in it. I would rather say not art as religion, but religious art. That means that art helps me to grasp the religious elements of Mahler's music more deeply. Mahler was a religious person through and through, and I even have the impression that he needed religion to find peace in his soul. I think it's wonderful that we also have it documented here that Mahler was baptized in Hamburg. But one can't really say that the magnificent music Mahler created here was also linked to his confession. No, the cosmos of Mahler's music transcends the confessional framework. Yes, one could even say that he transcends every Christian framework. I'm thinking here of Das Lied von der Erde, in which an ancient Chinese text in a translated German version is used, and where Mahler includes also ancient Oriental instruments in his works, but not as something exotic, but integrated fully into his music, into the composition. Mahler was a questioner, a hoper, a loving and suffering man. And I have the impression that this is the reason why his music appeals to so many questioners, hopers, lovers and sufferers today. And I'm one of them. Here we are in the St. Ansgar Church in Michaelis Street. Gustav Mahler was baptized here in this church, but not in this building. It took place in the church built here before, which was destroyed in the war. And that's a reason why this is a meaningful memorial site for Gustav Mahler. And I hope that we will be able to continue to hear a lot of music from him here. He once asked why he hadn't set the liturgy of the Mass to music. And the answer that he gave was, "My Eighth Symphony, that is my Mass liturgy." Gustav Mahler only conducted one concert in the Leithalle with works by Beethoven, Wagner and Tchaikovsky. He was on his way to New York and made a stop here in 1908. The family came from Vienna the next day. The concert took place on November the 9th, 1908. This green area is now known as Gustav Mahler Park. This Gustav Mahler Park was opened on May the 18th, 1988. And now you can reckon back. It was the 77th anniversary of Mahler's death, and the former mayor, Klaus von Dohnanyi, oversaw the inauguration. And now we have here this cube with a memorial plaque. I believe my interest in Mahler started even before, in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, when I was ballet director in Frankfurt. I first encountered his song, "I Have Lost Track of the World." That was the first Mahler choreography I did. It started slowly at that time because I did the fourth movement of the Third Symphony as a memorial for John Cranko, O Mensch. This sentence occupied my mind so much that I decided to look more closely at the entire symphony. Suddenly, I noticed that such a long and elaborate symphony would create the possibility of developing a dramaturgy which is novel and would fill an evening for a ballet. I.e., a dramaturgy which does not begin with a libretto, for which a composer was commissioned to write the music, but which actually begins with the music. And with Mahler's Third Symphony, the first entire symphony which I choreographed, it was clear to me that I didn't devise a libretto or a narrative story which existed before I actually translated it into dance. It was here in Hamburg, and everyone was against it, actually, except possibly Mr. Everding, August Everding, who was the general manager at the time, because he always supported me. But everyone else thought it was an absurd idea, and how could I even think of something like this? But I was persistent, as always, and thought, no, my instinct tells me that this is really the right way. And I think that the way for me, or the most important thing for me with Mahler, is you talked about an inner world, a trivial world, a more spiritual world. And I think that Mahler unified everything. And that's also something that dance does. Dance uses something completely everyday, the human being. And dance uses this human being in their movements to express certain things. And that brings us humans, when we observe it, into other worlds. And I see this in the form of Mahler's symphonies. that very often uses elements to seduce us somehow with something that is very accessible. Well, I don't think it's trivial, but almost trivial. A waltz, a Ländler, a march, which serves as a bridge into another world. And that is the reason why I have always been fascinated by his music. I think I was also fascinated with his person from the very beginning, with his fate. Perhaps also because he very often wrote his own texts. And I think the texts are extraordinary, fascinating and interesting. And quite often there are fragments or reflections from the world of Mahler's life. Not like autobiographical moments, but in the works which I created out of Mahlers. Professor Ruzicka, when the Gustav Mahler Association was founded in 1988, you were already playing a role in the founding board of trustees. As the general manager of the Hamburg State Opera after that, you not only managed to see to it that Gustav Mahler's memorial would be supported, but you also put together an exhibit in the Opera House Orchestra foyer, which was curated by Georg Borchardt at that time. You also ensured, among other things, that here in the Kolonnaden, the street sign Gustav Mahler Place be erected. That was also a novelty for Hamburg. Where does your dedication to Gustav Mahler come from? Yes, 1988 was a very important year. I began my tasks as general manager here at the State Opera and the Philharmonic State Orchestra. And so I took it upon myself to achieve some things, particularly on the subject of Gustav Mahler, one of the most important figures of cultural life in Europe and of course in Hamburg at that time. And our first step in the planning was a major Mahler festival in 1989, with numerous guest orchestras, guest conductors, and naturally our own Hamburg General Music Director, Gerd Albrecht. And in connection with the symposium, we put together a Congress report, which is still very readable today. And that was therefore an early highlight during this time. We had a Mahler exhibit in the State Opera curated by Jörg Burchardt, which received a lot of praise, found a lot of approval, and remained on display for quite a long time, and collated and made visible all of the places where Mahler had an influence, particularly during his time in Hamburg. So it was a start that was completely in the context of this great figure in Hamburg's musical life, Gustav Mahler. The subject of Gustav Mahler Platz, where we're standing today, had a long prehistory. Naturally, it was a request very close to my heart at the time. Even before the Gustav Mahler Association existed, we had to set such an example. There had to be a place geographically very close to and visible from the State Opera. And I can still remember that we had a lot to take care of beforehand with the authorities. It's not that easy to change the name of a street, but we had a big advantage here because there weren't any residents. This place doesn't have a postal address, but despite that, it went through many instances until it reached the Senate. Then it was basically the decision of the Senate. The first mayor, Ingo von Münch, was very helpful at the time. He turned it into his own pet project. And then we celebrated it on this day. It started with a trumpeter from the Philharmonic State Orchestra playing the post-horn solo from the Third Symphony, which filled and brightened the entire space. Then there were speeches from the mayor, von Münch, And from that hour on, this was seen as a new place in the history of this Hanseatic city. And I think we did something which made the most sense at that time. I'm sitting in front of the Komponistenquartier in Hamburg. Under this roof, the Gustav Mahler Museum, among other things, has moved in here. It's the first Mahler museum in Germany. It was sponsored by the Gustav Mahler Association Hamburg. Coordination of the museum was taken over by Albrecht Schulze. A number of experts and scientists stood by him. I will name Helmut Brenner, Alexander Odefey, Franz Willnauer, Hubert Stubner, and Fabian Scholpe. In this way, this small but beautiful and worthy museum became a monument for Mahler. I can highly recommend a visit to this museum. I am now near the Leidshalle, sponsored by the Hamburg ship owner Heinrich Leids. A great concert hall was finished in 1908. Gustav Mahler was in this hall and conducted here. There weren't any compositions by him on the program, rather works from Beethoven, Tchaikovsky and Richard Wagner. Mahler was on his second journey to New York and was accompanied by his wife Alma and his little daughter Anna. It was the last time he ever saw Hamburg. After much restless activity in America and Europe, he passed away 2.5 years later in Vienna. Gustav Mahler was active at the Hamburg City Opera for 6 years. I am delighted that the Hanseatic city of Hamburg, which had always been a Johannes Brahms city, has now become a Gustav Mahler city as well.